Hello future tech leaders, I am Sindhuja. Based on my own experience, I know that learning the right skills can shape our future. What if I say learning was as thrilled as the tech world itself? There we go. A cloud foundation, that's exactly what you will experience. From day one, you will be immersed in the interactive sessions and expert-led courses that covers most of the widely used technologies in the zone of data science to cloud computing, which brings more light to the life of a techie. I'm so excited to help you and unlock the true potential of a technology. Well, then why to wait? Let's see what it unfolds.
That's why I cover global configuration, because if there is any rule which is applicable to the entire system, or the other way of looking at it is if there is a rule that you would like to configure from an organizational perspective to everyone. If you have 5,000 users, usually what you would like is that there are 200 users who have access to Salesforce, and for them this should be the applicable rule, right? And basically, you will say that only people who have designation as consultant and department as sales will get access to Salesforce. But this rule has been created just for Salesforce, and that too for restricted number of users. But if you look at the entire organization, if there is a rule which basically, let's say if you are an employee of this company, you should only be using the company's laptop, right? That is a rule which is applicable for everyone. That sort of rule you can go and configure in global configuration. I hope it makes sense. It is applicable for all the employees. Correct? If you want to apply to all the employees, then that's the kind of configuration that you make in global configuration. Let's talk about how do you import users. If you remember, I did tell you that we were trying to import users through a flat file. Flat file is nothing but a CSV file. There is a flat file that I've chosen, which is lab1 users flatfile.csv. This flat file has user information of, let's say, 20,000 users. And now I want to import all these users into Saviynt. Because it is a new engagement, I'm implementing Saviynt for the first time, and hence I would like to create these users. What will I do? I will click on admin. I will click on users and I will click on upload user. Once you click on upload user, there are certain parameters for which you need to provide values. Saviynt will ask us that you want to upload users. What type of users or where do you want to upload it from? I can choose that. This is the file from where I want to import it. I will choose it. Right. And then I have a delimiter. The delimiter is comma, which basically means every column is divided through a column which is represented by a comma. The next thing is first row as heading. When I say first row as heading, that means that the entire. I'll show you the flat file in itself, how it basically looks like. That will give you a better idea. This is for the first one, first row as heading, right? That makes sense that yes, in my file the first row is heading. The second is called as 0-day provisioning. If you remember, I told you that there are certain rules which defines what access will a user get, right? And what user or what access is the user getting depends upon the company's policy. If the company says that every employee should get access to Outlook Teams box success factors, right, then you will need to. And if you're creating these users for the first time in savings, you can mention it as yes. Once you mention it as yes, that means that all these rules which the company has defined for a new user will be applicable for this user. If you mention it as no, it will not evaluate those rules. It will just create a user identity, but it will not create any accounts for the users based on those rules. Then you have generate username. If you remember, I told you that we can configure the system username generation rule. Whether that needs to be executed for this user or not. I'm mentioning yes. Similarly, we had generate user email. We are mentioning this as yes, right? Then you have check rules. Basically, we have one rule is that you need the 0-day provisioning, which is for new users. There are certain rules which are update rules. For those rules, if you want to evaluate those rules as well, you mention it as yes, otherwise no. Right now, what we want is we are creating these users, but we don't want to evaluate any rules because obviously we haven't configured it yet. As part of the training, once we go ahead and we implement those rules, then it makes sense for us to make them yes and then onboard users. Because if there is nothing in the system, what will the system evaluate? And I think this is also something that we discussed the last time, that Saviynt is able to identify that whatever columns were present in the flat file corresponding to that which column is there within Saviynt. And for the ones which is not there, it will be custom property, one which is nothing but a variable. You can name it anything you want, right? Let's say Saviynt do understand what is employed by, what is manager, what is job description, but it does not understand what is this, what is India, right? You will have to do a custom property one and you can rename it to country. Then you can go and import it. Once you import it, the new users that gets created, it will be called as new account. Sorry, the total users inserted. Inserted means new users. Updated means the existing ones which have been updated. Now we'll talk about how do we validate that these users have got created correctly. For that, you just need to go to admin and you go to identity repository. All the users that you have imported right now, the 2600 something 2511 users, you can type any of their name and you'll be able to see that user. And we also discussed that the system username rule will also create a new username for the user. What I told you that we'll discuss in this session was how to onboard applications such as Active Directory. This is the most important part. Basically, what you need to do is you need to create 3 artifacts. Let's say if there is a you join a new company and those guys ask you that you need to onboard application. How do you onboard application is what you are going to have a look at. This is actually called as application onboarding. Let's give a second. Here, what you need to do basically is that you have 3 artifacts. One is called as basically what you need to do is you need to create 3 artifacts. One is called as endpoint. One is called as security system. And the third one is called as connection. If you have created these 3 artifacts, half the battle is won. One is connections. And it is not that difficult to find. It is rather quite easy to create these. Again, as I mentioned, because we are using such a tool, it is really easy to do that. If you remember, we were talking about this, that we had something. We were discussing that we have something called as connection or connectors, right? We discussed that there is something called as connectors, which basically allows Saviynt to talk to different applications, right? We discussed that there could be one success factors box and all that good stuff. Now, once you copy all of these, you understand that the same connector cannot be used for each application. Each application needs to have its own connection, right? And to have a single connection, we will need to use a connector. Basically, within Saviynt, it is actually termed as connector. Basically, if you want to connect to any of these applications, what you need to do, you will obviously need to provide some parameters which can tell Saviynt where is this application situated, right? Because over the internet there are lakhs and billions of applications. How would you know which application should Saviynt connect to, right? For that, you need to provide the host name of the application. If there is a REST API, what is the host name? What is the username? What is the password? Only then it will be able to connect to that application, right? For that, you need to provide those details in Saviynt. Let's say if I consider that this is a Saviynt instance, let's consider that this is a Salesforce application. If I want to connect to Salesforce application through Saviynt within Saviynt, I need to define what is the host name of the Salesforce application instance. In my case, it is F40 Salesforce com. Then there could be, let's say, a username that I can log in with password. I don't know if you know this or not, but you're trying to connect to any of cloud services, you need something called as an authentication. There are two concepts. One is called as authentication. The second is called as authorization. What happens is for authentication, there are certain protocols which are OIDC Saviynt. For authorization, there's a concept called as OAuth2. Here, what I want to do is I just don't want to get access to within the application to certain objects, but I also want to restrict certain accesses. When it is defined within a request that I don't want to only access Salesforce, I want to access specific objects within Salesforce. To give you a business example, if you understand there is a Salesforce developer, he is developing an integration between Saviynt and Salesforce. If he or she is able to see everything within Salesforce, that won't be the right thing to do, right? Because Salesforce will have a lot of critical data of the company in terms of sales figures and a lot of stuff. A junior person should not be able to see that. Just see that. And hence, when we are using any kind of authorization protocols, we define that. If we provide all these details, what details such as hostname, username, password, client ID, client secret? And redirect URL. If you provide all these details, Salesforce will tell Saviynt that if you provide all these details to me, I will allow you to access the data that I have, right? But because organizations understood that if I give access to someone, I should not give access to everything. If there is an integration which is going on, the development or the implementation specialist should only get access to the objects that he wants to manage. In our case, those are users, group, or entitlements. Even if you don't understand these, it is fine. But you do understand users, which is important. And obviously groups, as a name suggests, is groups, right? What we do is, that is why this particular protocol that I just talked about, auth 2.2. The other two protocols will allow you to access or authenticate yourself and get access to these applications. But what they can do within the application is not defined. This can give you more access than required. This can give you less access than required. And basically these are governed differently. But in case of OAuth 2.0, you can define that you provide all these details to me and you will get something called as access token. I don't know if you know about it or not, but access token is basically like a key to your house. If you have the access token, Salesforce will know that the request is coming from an authentic source. That is why it is called as a token. What happens is, for the first time, say we need to provide all these details while making a request to Salesforce. Salesforce will evaluate all these details that the host has been provided correctly. The username is correct, password is correct, client ID is correct, client secret is correct, and the redirect URL is correct. If everything is correct, Salesforce will return an access token, which is a hex value, something like this. But this is a unique key, and this is valid for only some time. Let's say 2 hours. Going forward for the next 2 hours, if you want to get all the users which are present within Salesforce, you can make a get call to Salesforce. And rather than providing all these details again, you can just provide the access token. Because Salesforce remembers that it has sent out an access token which is valid for the next 2 hours. It's not required you to provide all the details again. This is actually called as OAuth 2.0, where you provide certain credentials, right? And then you get an access token. And then using the access token, you can retrieve whatever you want. By whatever you want, I mean whatever objects you are supposed to access, like users, groups, and entitlements. But if you want access to customer data or anything else, which is whatever is stored within Salesforce, you won't get any access to that. This is really good in terms of developing integrations because you only give access to what is needed. And that is called as authorization right. Now there is another concept with access token. There is also something called a refresh token. What usually happens is this data that I was talking about, the hostname, client ID, client secret. These data is very critical. If someone steals that data, they can make requests to your Salesforce instance and get the data that they want, right? And hence we do not want to share it over and over again. Basically, if you see, we are calling it as auth 2.2 because 1.0 was not, suitably designed. 2.0 does is it introduces something called a refresh token as well. Refresh token is also a hex value just like access token. But what it has more validity. Let's say if it is valid for 12 hours. After 2 hours, in ideal circumstances, after 2 hours, you would have again required to pass on all these details to Salesforce. Again, you get access token and now you can do whatever you want. But with the help of refresh token, what you can do is that once the access token expires, rather than providing these values again, hostname, username, password, you can rather provide the refresh token to Salesforce. And Salesforce will again issue an access token for you. How this helps is that you're keeping all the critical information within your system. You are not sharing it over the internet over and over again. and hence the chances of someone stealing it is less, right? That is how Auth 2.0 works. Basically, if you again, I'll also talk about where to get these values. And that is a question that even you should have. That I do understand that I need to provide all these values to Salesforce. I can understand that host name is something which is common. Username and password, I can use mine. But what about client, secret client ID and redirecting on it? Where will they come from? I'll start from firstly host name. Host name is something which is unique to your instance's Salesforce instance. It's not like that. While we access Facebook, Facebook's homepage is designed the same way for everyone, at least for most of us. Right. Absolutely. We provide our credentials and the page looks the same. But in case of enterprise applications, it is not that way because those are customized according to the customer's need. If Salesforce TCS is working on Salesforce, Infosys is working on Salesforce, all other companies are working on Salesforce. We need to identify that with Salesforce instance. Do we have to use, right? Because that is unique to us. That has been designed according to us. And that is why the host name is slightly different in case of applications which are enterprise level. Rather than typing just Salesforce.com, you might actually need to define your instance, which is, let's say, Salesforce 38.com. Right. This Salesforce instance is designed for TCS. Now you have username. Ideally, it should not be a person's username. Whenever you're doing integration, these should be service accounts. What are service accounts? Whenever there is an identity or a set of credentials which is not only for one person but can be shared for multiple people, that is called a service account. Basically, if you log into Salesforce or Facebook, you have your first name, last name at the red mail.com. Let's consider it that way. Just assuming. But in case there is a service account, there could be service account 1 at the red domain name.com. Because this can be shared by 2 or 3 people to maintain or to do technical jobs within an application. The username and password that we should be using here should be something which is common to a lot of people and which is not used to access the UI of the system. If you go to the Salesforce page, you provide your credentials, you'll be able to log into Salesforce right through the Salesforce site. But if it's a service account, you should not be able to do that. You should be only able to use the credentials to access it programmatically, which is through APIs. Why is that? Because I want to that even if they can't get compromised, I know that the person would not be able to see the UI, though they'll be able to see through making a request. The next part is the client ID. Client ID and client secret. You basically need to request the Salesforce team that I need your client ID and client secret. Why would you request that? Because we want to through client ID and client secret. Basically, Salesforce validates that this is again. Client ID is also a hex value. It will not make sense to you, but it makes sense to Salesforce because it is the application which is basically giving us that value. Client ID and client secret, both will be provided by the Salesforce team themselves. And you can provide those details in your request. When you pass these as to Salesforce, Salesforce will remember I did provide these client ID and client secret. I have created these and hence the request that is coming from outside should be a genuine request. It will not be some hacker who is trying to intrude my system. Right. I will also tell you how to create that. But ideally, we need not worry about it, because even if you are dealing with the connector will hold this information that we are to get. The client documentation will have this information that we are to get these client ID and client value from, client secret from. Then you have something called this redirect URL. Basically, redirect URL is more of a placeholder. Once all these details are validated and they are correct, the request will get redirected to a success page. And that page is something that once you log in, that is how you log in. And once you provide all these details, you can get access to users, groups, entitlements, everything. That is how basically a connector works. The reason I wanted to explain it to you, maybe everyone will not discuss the same thing. But the reason I am discussing this is you should understand how a connector is working at the back end. Everyone in the same documentation will tell you what is a connector. What is a connector to provide to connect to the target? But why do we need to? That is what we should understand. These are the details that you need to provide. But where do you provide that? Within Saviynt, a connector is represented by something called as connection. As I told you, different IDM tools name things differently, though it does the same work. Rather than calling it as a connector, we call it as a connection. And in connection, you need to provide all these details. Post name, username, password, client ID, client secret. The connector, which is basically the connection here, will pick up all these details and it will send it to Salesforce. And then it will say it was a validate that request. And if all of these things are correct, it will send back a success message. Right. And once you have a success message, now you can try to get accounts from Salesforce into Saviynt. It's actually the other way around. First, you provide all these credentials to get access, right? And once you are to get a success message, and once you have the success message, now you can create accounts in Salesforce and you can also retrieve accounts from Salesforce. Right. That is the first part of it, that you need to have a connector, which in this case is called a connection. That is what I will create in Saviynt. The second thing that I will do is called a security system. Whenever you are creating this connection, you have something called as a security system. Within Saviynt, security system acts as a bucket. It basically, let's first talk about endpoint. Within Saviynt, obviously, let's say if you have integrated Saviynt properly with Salesforce. Now a new user wants access to Salesforce. What will you do? You will go to the ARS form. What I was telling you was that you will have these details. The first thing that you are going to create is connection that you can connect to the target. And then you will create an endpoint. What happens is, while you are requesting access, now let's say you are a Saviynt administrator. There is a new user who came to you. That buddy, I need access to Salesforce because my new project is starting and I'm working as a Salesforce developer for that engagement. Right. You will have to provide that access through Saviynt. How will you do that? You will go to request access for others. Right. There is an option called is request access for others that you will see on the home screen in itself. I was just trying to see if we have that here. Let me know if you are going too fast. See, once you enter Saviynt and you want to request access for someone, you will have to go through certain steps. Basically, what you need to do is you need to go to the ARS form. The ARS form looks like. Can you see this? If someone comes through and asks you that I need access to this application, you will click on ARS application request system. You will click on request access for others. You will choose the application that you want to give access to the user. Select system. You can choose the system and then submit the request. What will happen is his or her manager will receive a request saying that your reportee has requested access to this application. Please accept or reject it. The reason I'm telling you this here is that before you can submit a request, you need to at least be able to see that application within the system. If there is an application which is not even connected to Saviynt, how will you create the user's account there? If you see, here you have listed all the applications: Oracle, AWS, Google Apps, AWS Master, whichever application the user need access to. For that you need to provide. You need to click on this add bucket and then click on submit. Basically, select application, select access, provide justification and submit. Right. The problem here is that you need to make sure that your application is visible here. And for that, you need to create an endpoint. An endpoint is nothing, but it is a logical representation of the application in Saviynt. Obviously, when we are choosing Oracle, this is not an Oracle system, right? This is Saviynt. Within Saviynt, we have created an endpoint point called as Oracle that the user knows that which application I'm requesting access for. And for that, I can add button, right? This is basically called as endpoint. Now, that's why I was telling you that for endpoint, you'll need that. We have created connection. We have created endpoint. And to correlate the connection with the right endpoint. Let's say if I've used the Oracle connector, provided all the details in the connection, and I also created Oracle endpoint within Saviynt, I also need to correlate them together, right? Because only together will they work. Right. If I click on this submit button, it should invoke the connector and that should create, let's say, be able to connect to the Oracle instance. And that is why I was terming security system as a bucket which is correlating both the endpoint and the connection. What we do is, I'll now again go to the same document that I was explaining you. What we have done is we have created a connection. I hope this is the same. This is how we create that connection that I was talking about. You go to admin, you go to connections. Click on connection list and you click on actions, and from actions you click on create connection. Once you click on create connection, you can then go and provide details. I was telling you right that we need to provide what type of connection are we using. If you are trying to connect to Active Directory, we will use AD. If you are using a Salesforce, you will choose Salesforce. If you are using Outlook, you will. From the drop-down, you will choose Outlook. If there is no by default connector for your application, you can use a generic connectors like REST, Scheme, Flat File or Database. We discussed that there are 2 or 3 type of connectors that we have right. You can use the connection type. Once you click on the connection type, accordingly the options will change. If I talk to you about AD connection parameter, if you want to connect to Active Directory, the parameters that you need to provide is different. If you want to connect to Salesforce, the parameter that you need to provide is different. If you want to connect to a database, the connection parameters that you need to provide is different, right? Depending upon what type of connector are you using, the parameters that you need to provide will change. Once you provide those details, you will say that connection was successful. You can basically provide all the details and then you can click on submit. And it will say that the connection is successful. Once the connection is successful, the next thing that you will do is to create a security system, right? What I was telling you about what is that you have to create that. Go to admin, go to security system, click on actions, click on create new, give it the same name that you gave to the endpoint, and then click on save. I'm just giving here the name as Active Directory, the security system name. Now, while I'm providing that, I also need to provide certain other values such as automated provisioning. It is enabled or disabled. By automated provisioning, I mean there are certain rules which are checked. If the rules are correct, you get access to Active Directory. If that is the case, you will say that it is automated provisioning. If you do not want to enable for certain applications, you can make it disabled. Whether I will be reconciling data from Active Directory or not. Yes, I will be. That is why I have my data as yes. Whether I will allow instant provisioning. That means I want to submit the request and don't want anyone to approve and just give access to the user. I mentioned no disabled. Other than that, other options are not that relevant, not that important. Once I have created connection, I have provided some details in terms of how to map users. I will reconcile data. How do we reconcile data? For that, I need to go to job control panel. But let's not go there because we have not covered endpoint. Basically, if you see, here besides security system, you have endpoint. You see it here, right? Once again, can you say what is exactly security system? A security system is basically a container which connects your connection to your endpoint. Right? There is no direct way of correlating an endpoint with a connection. You will have to create a security system, and once you create a security system, you will have to choose a connection and you will have to provide an endpoint. And that is how, if you remember, I was telling you that with ARs, you can go and request access for a user and that request is created through endpoint. And once I click on submit, The connection is used to establish connection to the target and create that user there, right? There is also other users of security system. In case you want to assign a workflow that, rather than giving access to the user to Salesforce directly, I want his manager or senior manager to approve it first. If that is the case, I can define something called as a workflow. And that workflow will allow me to create such a request. I think that is a import is fine. Actually, that is the reason. That is the reason why usually no one gets an understanding from the PDF directly. I don't remember if it was you or someone else, but there are plenty of my candidates who asked me that. Can you provide me the PDF upfront? And I always say no to this because if you see it, even here they have not maintained or not created this very properly. And that is why what happens is you will get a lot confused, a lot that this was happening. Then where did it go? Logically, to understand it, you need someone to explain it to you. What I was telling you about was that you created security system, endpoint and connection. You correlated all the three, and only while all these three are together you will be able to either provision or reconcile users. And finally, do not forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel.